This is Duke University.
As Thavolia mentioned, last April I published a book called Confederate Reckoning, Power and Politics in the Civil War South. And I thought, since you have to listen to a lot of people talking about the book today, I would just do something very simple, which is try to explain why I wrote a book on the Confederacy in the first place, not an obvious thing for a progressive scholar to take up, lay out the basics about how I did it, what I argued, and what I think is at stake in it. And unfortunately, my sense of what's at stake in it grows daily as this anniversary of the Civil War increasingly arrives. So in taking on this topic of the Confederacy, I was operating from the basic conviction that the scale and significance of white Southerners' bid for national independence had hardly been appreciated, that the history of the Confederacy was really a much bigger story than the one that has usually been told. To me, it seemed pretty clear that the founding of the Confederate States of America was a signal event in the history of the Western world. After all, what secessionists started to do, what they set out to do, was something entirely new in the history of nations. They wanted to build an explicitly pro-slavery and anti-democratic nation state dedicated to the proposition that all men were not created equal. No other class of slaveholders in the hemisphere tried this. In an age of nationalism, this kind of pro-slavery national independence movement has no peer. It also has no place in the literature on nationalism. Confederates were fully caught up in all of the turbulent currents of history that roiled the Western Hemisphere in the age of emancipation. That pro-slavery experiment that was launched here in the South was part of a far larger struggle then being waged in the 19th century world over slavery, democracy, and the powers of nation states. In terms of causes, dynamics, and consequences, the history of the Confederacy was part of and consequential to that struggle. In fact, it would end up recapitulating some of the most dangerous parts of that struggle in the age of emancipation. White Southerners acted out of confidence. I think sometimes we forget this. This is why they were the only class of slaveholders in the hemisphere to do it. These guys were flush with power and money, and they acted in complete defiance of the spirit of the age. They believed that they could launch this pro-slavery republic and sustain it even if it came to war. They were emboldened by what they called the failure of emancipation in other parts of the Western world. They were buoyed by the new science of race. I think this is turning off, is it? Okay, sorry. They were buoyed by the new science of race. They were convinced that the American vision of the people had been terribly betrayed, and in a sense, what Southern slaveholders did was seek the kind of future for human slavery and Republican government no longer possible by their lights within the original Union. So the Confederacy was simply a gamble. It was a huge gamble on the future of slavery. And with secession, white Southerners went all in. I mean, it was a poker game, and they put all their chips in. But the history of the Confederate States of America wasn't just shaped by conditions in the hemisphere, it fundamentally reset them. Because the Southerners' reckless attempt to build an independent pro-slavery nation not only failed, it brought down the most powerful slave regime left in the Western world, and it redefined the possibilities of democracy at home and abroad. And in addition, in the process, they provoked precisely the transformation of their own political culture that they had hoped to avoid by secession, the lovely justice of it all, bringing into the making of history precisely those people, including white women and slaves, whose political dispossession they had hoped to render permanent. In 1860, standing on the brink of war, nobody could have foreseen any scenario by which within 4 years, slavery would be destroyed totally and immediately as an institution of American life. In bringing on war, white Southerners created arguably the only set of conditions, war-born and state-sponsored emancipation, within which that could be accomplished. They brought it on themselves. To me, the Confederate States of America, the history of it, is not just a story of military defeat, but to me, far more powerfully, a story of political failure. And it was this big story I wanted to tell. about why the Confederacy was founded, what it attempted to do, and what happened when they tried it. As a political history, which is always my game, I think it's epic in its ambition and scale. Epic in its ambition and the scale of its reversals. For drama and justice, little matches the reckoning to which Confederates were subjected. One thing that has hardly been noticed in the history of the Confederacy is that that nation was based on an incredibly slim foundation of democratic consent. It claimed the consent of the people, but it was a highly restricted and I think insufficiently scrutinized idea of the people that's particular to 19th century racial democracies, and particularly the kind you got in slave states. Maybe 1.5 million Southerners out of 10 million in the population, 1.5 million being the number of white male voters, were ever consulted about the wisdom of secession and war. That's what it meant to be a democracy in the 19th century. Needless to say, it took far more of the people to build the republic and defend it in war than to get it out of the Union. And when war came, the Confederate national project was tried from within as well as from without. In terms of the practicality and justice of its national ambitions, the Confederate States of America was subject to the judgment of its own people, even as it attempted to survive the military test it faced from the Union Army. In other words, it involved a political as well as a military testing. That many of the people testing it were from the vast ranks of the politically dispossessed in the Confederacy, poor white rural women and enslaved men and women, shows the profound poverty of the founders' vision of the people. And it also, I think, suggests that we need to write a new kind of political history if that's not going to be the way we think of the people. So the book is about that project and about the reckoning that came with war. It has a tripartite organization. The first part begins with an accounting with the nature of the Confederates' national project and the process of secession. And the second and third parts are about the war and the reckoning with the people, first with poor white and yeoman women, and then more consequentially with the enslaved. Methodologically, the book engages a critical question, at least to me, critical question. I'm obsessed with this question, about how we write political history, and more importantly, whose political history it is we write. This, too, is one of the main reasons I wanted to write the book. My commitments were as much methodological as anything else. In the most basic sense, the book is an attempt to write a political history of the disfranchised, and that's how I was thinking of it. I think that's the only kind of political history that really matters when you're talking about the Confederacy. In the Confederacy, where the exclusion of the majority was the very raison d'etre of political life, a conventional history of voters and politicians, the men of the political community, as Jefferson Davis called them, would hardly grapple with what was fundamentally at stake in the Confederacy or take its full historical measure. In a sense, to write that conventional history is to play their game. It would, like all such traditional histories, push the boundaries of political history back to the definition of the citizen Judge Taney offered in the Dred Scott case in 1857, and which pro-secession Southerners were so anxious to fix permanently as the new boundaries of their nation. It was what the architects of the Confederacy attempted to make, a perfected republic of white men. In that political project, it was the exclusions, the way they drew the boundaries, that were the most salient features of the polity, and I think should be, of its political history. So to that end, I conduct what I think of as a kind of social history of politics, one focused on the political desires, objectives, and strategies of the disfranchised, and one that grapples centrally with gender as well as with race and slavery. That part, the gender history of politics, was the most difficult of all to do. And this is especially the case with respect to slave women, who are of no real interest to either government in the Civil War, and whose history is not much captured in the state records, Union or Confederate. That history of the disfranchised in the Confederacy, I argued, was really not a good fit for the usual liberal model around which most American political history is framed, the idea of the progressive inclusion of people in categories of citizenship, a kind of rights model of history. When I did turn up significant evidence of the politics of the disfranchised, poor white and yeoman women involved in an insurgent politics of subsistence that underwrote and legitimated a wave of food riots in 1863, or certainly the treasonous activities of slaves, men and women both, starting on Confederate plantations and radiating out from there, in interpreting the meaning of these politics, I purposely tried to reject the obvious and familiar model and push for a wider framing that instead likened their strategies more to what Partha Chatterjee has called the politics of the governed in most of the world. So to write the book, I borrowed a lot interpretively from feminist theories and histories, of course, and from race theory, but also from agrarian and subaltern studies. And as I've already suggested, I insisted on a broadly international framework for Confederate history. I suggest, for example, that the tumultuous process by which the Confederacy was driven down its own path to the enlistment of slave men to save the Confederacy, perhaps the most delicious moment in the whole horrible tale, and which has long been misinterpreted and still celebrated in the world of the internet and the long life of the Confederacy on the internet as the Southerners, as the Confederacy's choice of independence over slavery. This is how it's constantly posed. See, it really wasn't about slavery because in the end they were willing to give up slavery for independence. Well, no, they weren't. Actually, this is one of the most mistold tales of all. And what I really want to say is this is not about whether they were making a choice between independence and slavery. What this really shows us is that they were being forced by slaves themselves to recapitulate elements of a struggle that had unfolded across the hemisphere since the American and French revolutions. In seceding to escape history, Confederates lowered themselves into its most dangerous currents. The book thus seeks to eliminate the sweeping history of war and emancipation and to use the Confederate case to pose that relationship more directly and causally than is usually done. There's an important pattern in the history of slave emancipation in the Western Hemisphere, and it's one I think that is insufficiently specified in the historical literature, and that is the intimate association of war, enlistment, and emancipation in the modern period. It's something Robin Blackburn misses, for example, in The Overthrow of Colonial Slavery. He offers virtually all the evidence you need to make the case, but he refuses the causal link. He says war is not causally active, it's only incidentally active in a larger social process. I think that this is wrong. I think if we line up these cases across the late 18th and 19th century, with the exception of the British case, there's hardly anyone in which emancipation is not taken up as a project of war out of the state's interest in accessing the bodies of slave men for military service. What's relevant about the Confederate example of arming slaves is not that what they did was so radical, because it wasn't. You know, in the end, maybe they put 2 companies of men in the field in March or early April 1865. I mean, to call it the 11th hour is to understate the case. But what's important about the Confederate case is that they were driven to do it at all. It reflects on the whole logic of this incredible process that had been going on throughout the hemisphere for a century. The comparative pattern is entirely missed in the literature. The Confederacy is never seen as part of the larger hemispheric history of arming slaves or of war and emancipation, although it's in that context that what the Confederacy is forced to do becomes entirely predictable. This is not a little regional story. It's almost predictable from the minute they say it. And of course, they begin the war saying slavery is an element of strength, a phrase that we can't understand anymore, especially since they're not thinking at all about what slaves are going to do in the war. But it takes them a couple of years to realize that slavery is the greatest weakness that they, and the whole business of arming slaves is simply a different attempt to gain the labor of slaves for the Confederate cause. I mean, this was something Du Bois obviously understood very well. He uses that example very early on in the strike chapter to make that case. But more importantly even, this focus on this focus on the way war repeatedly generates states' interest in accessing the bodies of slave men, and the way it sets up a competition between military powers for the loyalty and service of slave men, not only eliminates the history of the Confederacy and slaves' actions within it, it also, and to me more importantly, illuminates a gendered history of war and emancipation, which has crucial implications for the narrative we tell. What I discovered when I started to dig into this is that there was a perseverant pattern in military emancipation policies whereby it doesn't matter what country you're looking at, whereby slave men are encouraged to take the martial route to emancipation and women the marital one, where personal or even familial freedom is extended as a condition of military service, a literal quid pro quo, you give us your service, you'll get your freedom. Military emancipation in those circumstances offers a path to emancipation open to men, but not to women. But it also confronts confronts states with threateningly large dependent populations of women and children. And whether we're talking about French Republican commissioners in Saint-Domingue in 1793, Benjamin Butler in Fortress Monroe formulating contraband policy in 1861, or Major General Patrick Claiborne laying out his plan by which the Confederacy could arm slaves, men are turned into soldiers and their women, and it's always put as their women, into wives, even if fictive wives. No matter that slaves could not be legally married, or that the woman who came through 150 miles to Fortress Monroe in men's clothing had no husband with her, military policies imagined the men as contraband or as soldiers and the women as their wives. So they were just turned into wives, whether they were or not. States administering the transition from slavery to freedom repeatedly reached for the paradigm of marriage to usher men into the headship of their households and responsibilities for their dependents, into the patriarchy that grounds citizenship, and women were ushered from slavery to coverture, hopefully with no stop along the way. It's not a pattern historians have much noticed, and all the references to marriage that litter government edicts and policies lie unanalyzed. Like a lot of people, I was set down this path, this analytical path, by the early brilliant work of Thavolia Glimpf, whose early work on contraband women and whose thinking about women in the Civil War really started me on this path. And I was also helped by historians of Saint-Domingue who are taking up these questions directly. There are books on arming slaves, and there's an anthology on arming slaves, and there's an anthology on gender and emancipation, but there's no essay on women in the Arming Slaves volume, and no essay on war or military policy in the Gender and Emancipation volume. We have a big gap in our thinking, and there's no Confederacy in any of them. The Confederate example is lost. What I'm trying to say that one of the values of the Confederate experience analytically and interpretedly is it reminds us that gender was a fundamental, not incidental feature of emancipation wherever it transpired. What I was trying to do in the book, in one sense, at least this was the beginning point, was to narrow what I saw as the huge gap between the sophistication of the social history of the Civil War and emancipation and the provincialism of the political history of the Confederacy. I mean, when you think about the history of the Confederacy, what do you think about? As always, my concerns were methodological as much as anything else. The history of the South and the Civil War, the history of the Confederacy, has been told very much as a regional story of concern mostly to itself. The last major history of the Confederacy was Emory Thomas's Confederate Nation, which was published in 1979. And he was obsessed with matters of white Southern identity, and he saw the revolutionary aspects of the war, which to his credit he did see, but he saw them as an isolated rupture in a long history of Southern continuity. It had nothing to do with what went before and nothing to do with what went after, and it really had nothing to do with what else was going on in the hemisphere. It's no exaggeration to say that the literature on the Confederacy has long been characterized by a preoccupation with the matter of military defeat and related questions about the strength or weakness of Confederate nationalism, a debate which has become not only stalemated but utterly boring in its predictability. The question of why the South lost the Civil War is hardly a minor one, don't get me wrong, but the preoccupation with military defeat has made it difficult for historians over generations to ask other questions about the slaveholders' war for independence and the profound changes it propelled in Southern and American political history. It tied up a whole generation of historians, including Armstead Robinson, in whose lineage my book clearly is, and not only because I, like him, am a Genovese student, but it established the terms of the losing debate brilliant people like Armstead were bound to have with military historians who were nowhere their equal in a professional sense. It was why Armstead spent so long trying to prove that the slaves' rebellion had a measurable effect, with the emphasis on measurable, on the Confederate Army's ability to wage war and to bring about defeat. It really wasn't a battle he could win, although he waged it heroically. That paradigm of military defeat certainly did not invite broad comparative thinking. Indeed, the focus on defeat produced a history of the Confederacy so parochial and limited it virtually invited itself to be ignored. It was certainly not a literature historians in other fields read, certainly not in the comparative history of slavery and emancipation. The Confederate case is just lost because it's never been situated. It's never been told, I don't think. So, for example, Rebecca Scott, in her first book on Cuba, compares both sides in the 10 Years' War in Cuba to the Union side in the Civil War, although she acknowledges how poor a fit it is. Cuban slaveholders, driven to some radical measures by the competition for loyalty and military service of slave men that they had been forced into in this protracted war with emancipationist nationalists, those Cuban slaveholders bear far more resemblance to their counterparts in the Confederacy than anyone in the Union, but clearly it never occurred to her to think about their likeness to Confederate slaveholders. And why would it, given the state of the literature? But in terms of the irrelevance of Confederate history, I think the coup de grace is that even as the United States, even as we were galvanized in the 80s and 90s by a series of critical questions about the nature of the Civil War and emancipation, as we finally took up Du Bois's lead to investigate slaves' war for independence, slaves' war for emancipation, and we had that incredible debate about who freed the slaves, even as we produced a new national narrative about the Civil War and emancipation, the Confederacy was not part of this discussion. The Confederacy matters in secession, and it matters in defeat, but nothing that happens in between is of any consequence at all to anything we think about the Civil War. The new history of the Civil War is really a history of the Union in the war. It tells the story of how the war for union became a war for emancipation and about how it established slaves and especially and above all black soldiers as central actors in this grand human drama. And this is an amazing story, and we should tell it as often and as loudly as we can. But between us, I have a question about that story, about how much sense does it really make, the amount of attention that we have focused on black soldiers in the last few years. Because if the heroic story of black Union soldiers' struggle for freedom and citizenship is one central dynamic of war and emancipation in the American Civil War, it is hardly the only one. It's surely worth remembering that only about 150,000 enslaved men served in the Union Army and Navy, that military service was a route to emancipation open only to men, and that while as many as maybe 500,000 slaves have made it to Union lines in the course of the war, the rest, which would leave about 3 million, remained on plantations and farms in the Confederate South in a state of presumptive slavery. The vast majority of slaves, in other words, fought their war against the slaveholders and the slaveholder state exactly where they lived. And that was the history I wanted to write, not about the people who made it to Union lines, but the ones who were stuck, but who knew the stakes in the Confederates' war. So in a strange way, I wanted to establish or reestablish the significance of developments in the Confederacy to the history of the Civil War we now tell, to show how slaves' politics shaped policy and history, not just in the Union where we have been taught to look, but in the Confederacy as well. And in this sense, I really was following in the tradition of Du Bois, but digging more into the developments in the Confederacy and the way slaves' actions on plantations were consequential for the Confederate military and their ability to wage war. The focus on the Confederacy to me at least, is a critical reminder that the struggle for emancipation proceeded on many fronts in the Civil War. It was advanced by people and processes only partly aligned with the Union States' emancipation policy, and it cannot be reduced to a history that follows a route through war to emancipation taken by some, but certainly not most men, and no women. In that sense, it reanimates a vital part of the national narrative, and it does it by trying to sketch the outlines of a history we are just beginning to write of gender and emancipation, and I know you already talked about that yesterday. The politics of slave women in the American Civil War fits no state narrative, Union or Confederate, and the recent focus on black soldiers makes that much clear. But the emphasis in my book on the actions of slaves on Confederate farms and plantations, the fact that planters were as much afraid of the actions of rebel women as rebel men when they made their lists of dangerous slaves who had to be removed from proximity to the enemy, there were always as many women on that list, including women with infant children, very interesting lists. So if you look at it from the point of view of the state, the women don't matter at all. If you look at it from the point of view of the planters, this is a war women and men are fighting equally against their masters and their masters' nation. So my emphasis on the actions of slaves on Confederate farms and plantations in developments not captured by federal agencies or their statist agenda highlights the messy, uneven, and protracted process by which slaves fought for and won their freedom. Indeed, Union emancipation policy also emerges from this analysis, I think, in sharper focus as a specifically military policy. I mean, I know we know that, but sometimes I think we don't really name it. A military policy that opened up entirely different possibilities for men and women. To put slave women back into the equation, I think, is to be challenged to write a broader and more accountable history of the Civil War and emancipation than we have managed to do so far. Well, let me just conclude by thinking a little bit about the moment we're in. There's a really odd quality to this experience today for me of talking to you all about a book on the Confederacy. I certainly feel delightfully like I'm preaching to the choir, but sadly it is not always so. There is still a very large public audience for books on the Civil War, and in the South for the subject of the Confederacy specifically, and it's still one that, as I have learned, even since this book came out, generates a great deal of light and heat. Ancestral histories are alive and well in the American South. To run a stake through the heart of that version is proving harder than one would think. Nothing has generated more controversy so far about my book than the first part, which I did not expect, its treatment of secession and blunt account of the nature of the Confederate political project. It's taken as impolite in some circles to actually name what the Confederacy was about. Du Bois confronted the forbidding edifice of the Dunning School in the history of Reconstruction. I think we did pretty well with that one. But sometimes it seems to me that the history of the Civil War, and especially the Confederacy, is the last holdout, that we need to be perpetually on guard against Confederate deniers, which is how I really have come to think of them, trying not to use the obvious analogy, which I think is merited, but, well, maybe you can all embolden me to use it. Certainly this was not a conversation we were able to have in 1961, in the last commemoration of the Civil War. And I think it's more important than ever that we insist on having this conversation now. As we approach the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, 150 years ago next month, South Carolina seceded from the Union. So as we approach this anniversary, I think we have to confront again the poverty of the Confederates' political vision and the absolute necessity of its defeat. The story of the Confederacy forms an arc of history, I think, rarely matched for dramatic interest and historical justice. As we commemorate the history of the Civil War, I think we need to tell that story again and again so that nothing of its claims survive into another century. Thank you.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.